Rachel. Hey, Katie. It's great to see you both.
Great to see you too.
I
Thanks
have
so
to say,
much
I
for
was also really taken by what a large turnout we had for our discussion about the crisis in the Middle East. That said, I was a little bit frustrated. We didn't have more time to get to more questions, so I'm very glad we're doing this.
me too, and thank you for taking the time to do this. But yeah, we had so many questions this month. It was really impressive from our audience, so I'll just jump right in. One audience member asked, given the scope and coordination of the attack last weekend, do you think that Iran and Russia played a role?
Well, there's no question whatsoever that Iran played a role. And while there is some debate whether the Iranian government and military leadership was aware of the specific timing and deployment of the Hamas attacks themselves, it is worth noting that Iran has been providing financial and logistical support to the Hamas terrorists for many, many years. There is increasing evidence that Iran was involved in the preparations for this. We don't know for certain yet. But even if that turns out not to be their case, Iran's ongoing role in supporting Hamas and Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations throughout the Middle East over the years certainly gives them some responsibility for what's taken place.
And for our next question, Dan, do you think Hamas wants Israel to launch a full-scale invasion and occupation of Gaza?
Oh, that's a great question, Katie. I think Hamas, and for that matter, Iran, desperately want Israel to mount not just a full invasion, but a full occupation of Gaza. Keep in mind that that territory is very urban, it's very compressed, it's very crowded, and that Hamas terrorists embed themselves with Palestinian civilians in schools and hospitals and mosques and otherwise. So it's incredibly treacherous territory for any foreign military. But keep in mind that while Israel has now called up hundreds of thousands of reserves, most of these reserve conscripts are not necessarily highly trained in the intricacies of urban warfare. And so a long-term Israeli presence would be extremely damaging to Israel, not just in terms of military losses and loss of life, but from a political and geopolitical standpoint. An ongoing Israeli presence in Gaza sends precisely the wrong message for a country that's looking to build international support rather than lose it.
So in the same vein, will the killing of innocent civilians in Gaza turn some countries against Israel?
Well, absolutely, Rachel. And in fact, we're already beginning to see that happening. As we record this conversation, it's less than 2 weeks. It's about a week and a half after the original Hamas attacks. And already the international news coverage is focusing overwhelmingly on the suffering in Gaza. And I don't mean to make light of it. There is real suffering taking place, innocent men, women, and children. But that said, because the original Hamas attacks on Israel took place already 10, 11 days ago, as the war progresses, those original attacks are going to get less and less attention. And Israel's countermeasures are going to get more and more notice from international media and an international audience. So the biggest challenge for Israel going forward, I would argue, is not even the military challenge, which is considerable, but rather a reputational challenge, is continuing to fight back, to protect itself, to try to ensure that Hamas is no longer in a situation to attack again in the future, without completely forfeiting international support and international sympathy, which in the first few days leaned in the direction of Israel, and already now is leaning precipitously in the other direction.
And Dan, I want to finish up with this important question. 75 years have passed since Israel was created. Will there ever be a two-state solution?
There has to be. And right now, as President Biden has correctly pointed out, in the immediate future, the prospects are particularly small. It's impossible to see the domestic political audiences in either Israel or the Arab states supporting something that requires compromise during such a highly fraught time period. But if the Hamas attacks were designed not only to entice Israel into a full-scale occupation, their ultimate long-term goal was to derail conversations between Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Israel, which until the Hamas attacks took place, appeared to be on track toward a three-way diplomatic solution that, while it might not have included a formal Palestinian state, would have reflected major changes in that direction. But just as 5 years after the Yom Kippur War back in 1973, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, on behalf of the countries of Egypt and Israel, signed the Camp David Accords, I believe that once this war is over, weeks or months from now, there will be a sustained push toward a two-state solution. If anything else, the violence in recent weeks tells us that there is no other practical alternative. And even though there are strong opinions on both sides that it's not an acceptable solution, we've been reminded once again in very stark and very difficult and very bloody ways that the status quo is just simply not sustainable.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, and again to our audience for submitting so many great questions this month.
They were great questions. And even with this follow-up, I know we really just touched the surface. So hopefully with the November conversation, talking not just about Israel and Gaza, but about Ukraine, about China and Taiwan, about the US-Mexico border, we'll be able to revisit some of these topics when we get together again in a few weeks.
Well, we'll see you then. Thanks, Dan.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Thanks, guys.